Blunt Research Chair at the National Postal Museum. And it is my pleasure to welcome James Peter Goff. Many of you know him as Jamie. He began collecting stamps over 60 years ago, published his first article in Linz in 1973, and has been writing ever since. For nearly 30 years, he's been a major contributor to philatelic research. The American Philatelic Society recognized these contributions in 2020 with the Leff Award for Distinguished Philatelic Research. His work has resulted in public talks, scholarly articles, and most recently, a multi-volume study titled The Postal History of the Universal Postal Union. The first two volumes, subtitled The Postal Card Worldwide, 1869 to 1974, were published in January 2020 by the Royal Philatelic Society, London. The Society is currently in the process of publishing the next volumes, which will consider rules, regulations, and rates 1874 to 1974. We look forward to these next volumes and this landmark study, The Postal History of the UPU, and today's talk.
Thank you, my dear fellow philatelists, for showing up today. As you're aware, I'm going to be talking about the postal card. For those of you that haven't seen it before, this is the first of the two volumes that came out on 2020, published by the Royal Philatelic Society. And unfortunately, it sold out in a few months, so I understand there's none available from the publisher. And that's a shame, but c'est la vie. Let's see here. This is what the cover looks like. It was very well designed by Brian Trotter. Background on the book. There are a series of volumes in development over the last 40 years. The first two volume segment is dedicated to just postal cards. Because I found that there was really very little information on postal cards by themselves as a topic, but I had been collecting postal cards not as a stationary collector, but as a postal historian, because there's a lot of interesting information about postal cards that most postal historians are unaware of. The table of contents is 6 pages. It's a rich history. The two books combined are almost 1,000 pages. They have 850 illustrations of just postal cards from a postal history perspective. I have a long list of contributors because I don't own all of this material myself, even though I have 3,000 to 4,000 pieces of material in my collection. And I have found that postal cards just don't seem to get the respect that postage stamps get, or even postal stationery if you're including the world of it. The book won the RPSL's Crawford Medal for Best Book of the Year. That also won the United Postal Stationery Society's Lewandowski Medal for Best Book of the Year. And it also won Best in Class at London 2022. I thought I'd just give the viewers an overview of the book structure for in case anybody has more interest. First of all, I define what the difference is between postal cards versus postcards. I define GPU versus UPU. It's the same organization. It changed its name. I also discuss how rules, regulations, and rates survive from one Congress to another. So often people believe that if they pick up a copy of the post-Congress documents, that everything they'll ever need are in those documents. What they don't realize is those documents have a very short life after each Congress and before the next. And so as you can see here, there are a lot of definitions that are necessary in the collecting of UPU-related material if this is a theme for you. And I define what all these are for me in writing the book. Also, there are some sections where I provide copies of documents. Blue boxes give contextual information that is related to material within that chapter. Then there are also information with regard to printings, numbers recorded in exchange of postal cards. And I cite the sources and everything for this because as a collector, this is particularly very useful. And I also, as you'll see, go through modifications to UPU rules and regulations between Congresses. Most collectors are unaware of the fact that the UPU would have mail votes, and that these mail, MAIL votes, would be used to actually change rules and regulations of the UPU. And so people get frustrated when they go into rules and regulations published after various Congresses, and they can't find certain information. And sometimes the information doesn't make it into the post-Congress documents, or if it does, it might take 3 or 4 Congresses before it makes it into a post-Congress document. And that's when people discover, hey, this is missing, like with color coding, was introduced in 1879, but didn't make it into any of the Congress documents until after the Congress of Washington in 97. So there's a lot of this kind of information floating around in this book, and more of it will be unveiled in the next 3 volumes, which I hope to have done next year. Also, green boxes. What are green boxes? I've told you about blue, and now I've told you about yellow. Green boxes are translations of important documents to provide veracity for certain things like transitional rates that the International Bureau would grant to new members, and you don't find them in any of the other documents. So these are typically the adhesion documents, and the UPU doesn't use the term admission documents for members. They say adhesion, because for them, this is a big difference between being admitted and having an adhesion, where it's at the choice of the new member to join and not waiting for an invitation from the UPU secretariat. Footnotes are important throughout the book because these also provide context and information that is not otherwise widely known or accessible by collectors. And I've had quite a few collectors who bought the book tell me how much of this is the kind of information they've been looking for and couldn't find until they stumbled on my book. Now that's how you maneuver through the book and how it helps you if you can find one. You're gonna have to find a used copy unless we can convince the Royal Philatelic Society to do another printing, but they don't tend to like doing that because they feel that it undermines the investment of those who took the risk and bought it when it first came out. But as the author, I would be more than happy to see them do reprints. I keep getting requests for reprints, or at least make copies for people, but I'm not in the business of undermining my publisher. So the first postal cards of the world were issued by Austria and Hungary almost 6 years before the General Postal Union started. And you say, well, why are you covering something that came out 6 years before? Well, until the General Postal Union embraced postal cards, while they were spreading around the world, they weren't spreading all that quickly. Postal cards, though, were having an amazing social revolution in communications, initially intended for local mail, usually same day in most cities. And few countries even thought that anybody would want to use it for foreign destinations. But after Austria issued the first cards, the model did spread, but most often with small changes or limitations by each copycat country. And so you had whether or not postal cards would be treated as letters or non-letters. Non-letters meant that it was not always same-day delivery. There were different approaches to targeting the rate of postal cards in different countries. A number of countries said, well, we don't want to undercut letters because the letter rate helps us pay for everything. Others who had the same belief that the Austrians did, that discounting the rate of postal cards would actually increase demand for postal cards and total volume and increase total revenue. There were different approaches to sizing, whether or not there should be an imprinted stamp or a formular card, where you had to buy a stamp separately. And the formular cards in most countries were typically for free, and they were on a countertop somewhere in the post office. And in many countries, foreign destinations were prohibited, even if you were willing to pay a letter rate to the foreign country. So there was a lot of trial and error, experimentation going on, and everybody started tracking each other. The post offices, mostly in Europe, were sharing information with each other about all this, so that by the time the Congress of Bern in 1874 came about, there seemed to be some congealing around what they should or shouldn't do with postal cards. And so it's kind of interesting to study the pre-GPU period, because you get to see what all the different countries were thinking about. And it also bolstered their own judgments and positions at Bern 74. Some countries initially issued formular cards while preparing postal cards with imprinted stamps, such as Chile. And the first reply paid cards, or what we call reply cards, were issued by Germany in magenta and Bavaria in green, both of them in 1874. And both of them agreed to exchange cards with each other because they had an effective postal union. Here is the early first cards of Austria and Hungary. Now, people always refer to Austria as having issued the first postal card, but you have to realize Hungary issued two cards, one in German and one in Hungarian. And we find those cards like the one in the upper right-hand corner of this double page is in Hungarian. And then the one in the bottom left is in German, issued by Hungary. And the one in the upper left is Austria. And the differences between the Hungarian and Austrian cards are the coat of arms. But what's interesting is that these cards were not mutually usable. So a Hungarian could not use a Hungarian card in Austria. Austrians could not use Austrian cards in Hungary, because the postal administrations were autonomous from each other at this time. And while they adopted similar rules and regulations, simultaneously, they did not accept each other's franking. Now, I'm going to share a few various types of rates, particularly in the early years of the General Postal Union. First, let me state the General Postal Union and the Universal Postal Union are the same organization. They just changed their name at the Congress of Paris in '78. There's some argument as to when the name change became effective, but the general rules from Congress to Congress is that whatever change was made in a specific Congress would not become effective until the effective date of that Congress document. So for that reason, many of the changes are not considered effective, like from the Congress of Paris in June 1878, were not legally effective until the 1st of April, 1879. We have what are called base rates for letters as a starting point in pricing postal cards. The range of choices was 20 centimes to 32 centimes. What's interesting is while the lower range of 20 to 24 centimes was possible, no founding member chose a rate that low. Serbia is listed at having chosen a 20 centime rate, but that was a misprint. And I've spoken to several Serbian specialists who continued to assure me that the 20-cent rate posted was in fact incorrect, that it was 25 as a base rate to other members within the General Postal Union. However, once they set the letter rate, postal cards could be no more than half of the letter rate. And so this is where things get kind of interesting, because half of 25 is 12 and a half. And for some countries where their currency converted to 12 and a half centimes, such as Germany, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, etc., that they in fact went ahead and used half of their letter rate. And the letter rates were actually not exactly equal to the rates that they were claiming, but they were allowed to get away with those rounding errors. And the reason why is that rounding was permitted at the Congress of Bern if by rounding you stayed at the next coin of common use for whatever that rate was. All members of the founding members of the General Postal Union were required to issue postal cards. This was the first experiment by the General Postal Union, and all members were required to participate. Furthermore, a number of members tried to charge extra for the postal card itself, the cardboard, but the members all agreed that there should be no extra charges other than the actual face value imprinted on the card. Although members could use formular cards, they still could not charge extra for the card. No member actually went below 25 centime rate for letters, which I told you about already. And the maritime rate was for distances of more than 300 nautical miles. Well, what's interesting is Egypt was a founding member, and Egypt said, well, there's no port within 300 nautical miles of our exchange office on the Mediterranean. And so we're going to just charge maritime rate for all mail going to all other GPU members. Well, France, the United Kingdom, Italy, and a number of other European countries began to realize Egypt was violating the rules on rates. And so they protested, and the next year, Egypt actually lowered its rates to comply with everybody and their interpretation of maritime rate. Because at this time, maritime rate was, although not stated as such, was intended for distances to North America like the United States. Now notice we go from a Congress to a conference. After the Congress of Bern, the International Bureau delegated authority on admissions to the International Bureau was delegated authority on all admissions of new members. So we find here that instead of having to negotiate among all the members at a Congress, they would instead make suggestions, and the International Bureau would decide on rates and other rules and requirements. So this is when India and the French colonies are all admitted. They didn't like all of the politicking and the horse trading that went on at Bern 74, and it was being repeated again in the early days of the Conference of Bern. And a lot of countries actually didn't even bother showing up at the Conference of Bern. So it was pretty much left to the International Bureau to decide these things. And we end up with a range of rates. For France and its global colonies, they chose a 40 centime rate equal to 4 pence. In England, India chose 6 annas, which was technically over the limit, but they were allowed to go ahead with that. The UK chose an 8-penny rate via Brindisi, or a 6-penny rate if the the long sea route. And so everybody was kind of all over the place. And this would provide for some interesting diplomatic fights when all these rates became known by mostly non-attending members, including the United States and some of the other European powers. But the International Bureau, when they were given authority to decide the adhesion of new members, many of the new members were poor, they were overseas, there were a lot of problems. And so many of these new members claimed that maritime rates couldn't work for them, that they would be losing money on every shipment of mail. So the International Bureau looked at the generosity of the delegates at the Conference of Bern and decided to be generous as an assumed power within their delegated power. But we would find out at the Congress of Paris in 78 that that's not at all what everybody else intended to happen. And so transitional rates exist from new members in 76, 77, 78, into early 79. Postal cards were also granted optionality by the International Bureau, and many of the members that did not attend were kind of annoyed by this. The feeling was, if you're going to be a member of the General Postal Union or the UPU, you got to comply with the regulations and rules. And the rules require everyone to issue postal cards, so you can't escape this. But a majority of new members in that period of 76 to 79 chose not to issue postal cards because they just thought they would save money. Everybody was cringing at the idea that if you wrote small enough, you wrote in different color ink, you wrote horizontally and diagonally, etc., you could squeeze a full letter onto the back of a postal card. And so they didn't want people cheating the postal service by doing that. And so if you were going to include the correspondence of a letter length, you had to send it in an envelope at the letter rate. So at the Congress of Paris, in response to all the chaos and all the different exemptions and exceptions that were administered by the International Bureau at the Conference of Bern, they went ahead and standardized rates for all members. This is when they changed the name from General Postal Union to UPU as a marketing endeavor to get more and more countries to participate. Not just to have the whole world involved, but also if ships could be pulling into ports en route, picking up mail and dropping off mail, it would also lower the total shipping charges. Transitional rates were canceled effective 1st of April, 1879. Some kept their transitional rates as maritime rates when the maritime rates were boosted in 78 to 100% rather than just 50%, as had been the case at Bern. Postcard and DICHA requirements were introduced, and this is where Union Universelle Postal was required to be printed on the address side of postal cards. They thought about having it done for stamps and also letter mail, but that did not make it. And they also introduced the concept of a special convention. So now we have an optional service for reply paid postal cards that Germany and the Netherlands pushed hard for and were able to get as options for members. And what's interesting is when you're able to come across mail where, despite optionality, these cards, reply cards, are being sent to people who didn't issue them, and they started complaining. And those, in my mind, are great rarities in the postal card field. Now, on this next page, I'm going to hit on a few interesting pieces of information. Many people have probably wondered, why on a postal card did they have the statement address only on this side, and on the message side they'd have message only on this side. And so the first, on address only on this side, if you look at this Guatemala postal card in the upper left, the sender not only included the address, but also the message on the address side. And in the first period of people issuing postal cards before GPU, this was not necessarily a common problem, but it happened from time to time and became a problem for postal carriers as they would just get bug-eyed trying to decipher the address. And then on the other hand, when you would have message side, including addresses, that also caused problems. So you would have a blank address side and the address to where it was going would be on the message side. So they were having these kinds of problems, and that's why they began to include that information. Foreign postal cards could sometimes be used domestically if you put domestic rates of postage on it. And so the two cards on the right are Canadian stamps being used in domestic British mails. What's also interesting is postal cards were much cheaper than letter mail. And in some cases, when you had financial companies having to provide certain financial information at the end of every year before stockholder meetings, they would put it all on a postal card. They'd print it and send that out because that was a very cheap way of sending information. People weren't getting the big, thick prospectuses that you get now. And in particular, when sending foreign, they would bundle up these cards among stockholders and send them in bulk mail shipments as letter mail. And then when they got, like here on the one in the lower left, was a US postal card used for shareholder information sent to Hawaii, where they had an agent put stamps on the front of the card so they could be mailed within those countries. This is the only one for Hawaii I've ever seen. It doesn't mean that it's the only one that exists. It's just the only one I've ever seen. On the right side, we have the list of early members that chose to not issue or issue postal cards. And then I have on the left side the date they joined, as well as the next column, we have the India exemptions accepted by issuers. So we see who didn't want to issue it. And we have the countries on the right side where the India exemption was rejected by these new members, which included Jamaica, just about Jamaica and Canada and Newfoundland, the only ones in the British Empire overseas members that rejected the India exemption. They thought that rejecting the exemption was a way of proclaiming poverty and lack of development, and they didn't want to be seen as that, which is why you end up with other countries like Japan and Argentina, and Danish West Indies, etc. In the early 1870s, businesses found that a way to market was to include postal cards in magazines and newspapers as a means of sending a reply back saying, yes, I'll buy one of those. Please send me this, please send me that. But a lot of countries did not allow foreign postal cards to be used in their system. So this is a very early 6th of August, 1873, first issue American postal card, first design, I should say, whereby a Canadian used the card as a quick and easy and added letter postage. What's interesting, 6th of August is a very early date. We still haven't seen, or I haven't seen, earlier dates than this for the exchange of mail between the United States and Canada, the exchange of postal cards. But I have a postal card from the United States to Canada on the same date. And I don't think that's coincidental. I think that that may be the earliest date that the public notices published in July finally caught up with the public and they started to try to use postal cards to each other. UPU indicium on formula cards sold with stamps became one of the ways of meeting the requirement of the indicia. On the right, they began to allow postal cards to be attached to much larger objects as essentially address cards. And so here's an address card that was glued to a newspaper by a German sailor. Here's a first day use on GPU day of Austrian postal card to Basel, Switzerland. What's interesting about this is the postal card rate went up this day from 4 Kreutzer to 5 Kreutzer, and the post office held this back thinking it was underpaid, and it was, but for the wrong reason. It should have had 3 Kreutzer added instead of only 2. And it still went through despite the fact the GPU prohibited postal cards to be sent if underpaid. We had some other rules, such as not being able to put your name or return address on the front address of a postal card. And so this British Honduras postal card was transited London, and it was stopped in London, stamped contrary to regulations by the foreign branch, and sent back to British Honduras, where it was not re-forwarded. One of the fun things for me as a collector is finding these early specimen cards from the printers. This card was engraved, and unlike the actual issued postal card, this trial card or proof was the paper was wetted, so it actually shrank, and it's not exactly the same size as the issued card. All part of the history in the early production of postal cards. I should also probably mention here that the United Kingdom, when it first issued its postal card, called them postcards. When the United States issued its first postal card, we called them postal cards. And it's interesting that we would take a divergent approach. We translated the French into English as close to literal translation as possible. That's how we ended up with postal card. The British were not very fond of translating the French into something so transliteral that they used the term postcard. And so it was interesting that from the earliest days in the English-speaking world, there are a number of countries that one way or the other on that translation. This card is a large-size postal card that was primarily issued for domestic use at the 1-cent rate. But this card was upfranked at a full letter rate to go to Germany. And the United States did the same thing, as did a couple of Australian colonies, where the cards for domestic purposes were made larger so that citizens in the country would have more space to write their messages. But cards of this size were prohibited by the UPU unless franked at the letter rate. But they're really, really hard to find franked at the letter rate, much harder than finding them sent postage to. One of the other issues where mail would be returned is if it was addressed to a non-member. This is returned for postage, and it was addressed to New Zealand before it was a member, and it was returned to Belgium, where apparently the sender did not uprank it and forward it, but kept it. Same here on a postcard to Natal before its membership in the UPU. It was stopped in London and then returned to Canada by the London Post Office. So you find these kinds of hand stamps for various countries around the world. One of the other things that the General Postal Union tried to get countries to do, if you didn't have a decimal currency, they tried to get you to change your currency to to a decimal currency. So Germany and Denmark were two of the earlier compliant members, converting their currencies to decimal currencies, and they both allowed periods of time in which they could both be used together. So this is a 2 postal card being used with the 8 euro for the 12 euro rate to Norway. And this is, I've been told by Lars Engelbrecht, a leading expert in Danish postal stationery, that this card is thought to be the only one mailed with mixed currencies to Norway. One of the things that caused the India exemption was when the British and India post offices began to notice senders of postal cards writing incredibly small, almost indecipherable messages in order to avoid using a letter. And so this was one of such examples where the India Post Office said, we can't put up with this. You know, the Indian people are incredibly frugal and inventive, and they will figure all sorts of ways around avoiding letter rates. And so this is just one of those examples. But this one, rather than being between Britain and India, was between Finland and Austria. One of the early maritime rates was from France to the United States. And this is, the French had a maritime rate for letters at 40 centimes. And so this is the maritime rate at 40, at half of that, or 20 centimes. These are exceedingly difficult to find. I don't think I've seen more than 4 in my life, and that includes trips to stamp shows in France and French auction catalogs. So, and notice the terminology, carte postale, which is a from which the Americans transliterated postal card. This is a fascinating one, misdirected from the German post office in Constantinople to Mexico, sent as addressed instead of Chile, because Valparaiso is not in Mexico, it's in Chile. And at this time, Chile was not a member. So this card should not have been transmitted, but there was no return address on it. So the German post office sent it to Chile anyway. And they had a postal agreement with Chile, and postal cards sent under postal agreements with non-members are particularly desirable in my mind. And so you see on arrival in Chile, it received the hand stamp Franca, and Franca was so that the destination office wouldn't charge it postage due, because the Chileans figured if the Germans wanted to send this without getting any postage out of it, well, that was their choice, and Chile didn't care. Here is a formular card sent from Germany to Spain. It ended up being held for postage. And at this time, Spain was the first non-German speaking country to get a discount rate of postage on letters and postal cards. And so this was mailed at less than that discounted rate. And so it ended up being held for postage in Haspa. And according to Hans-Peter Frecht, who wrote the definitive work on German formula and postal cards, this is the only card known to Spain in the pre-GPU period. So it's a novel item for German postal history for all sorts of different reasons. Here we have transit marks on postal cards were only permitted on the address side. I have plenty of them with transit marks on the back, but interestingly enough, transit marks on the front are more difficult to find. And I also want to point out the fact that it shows the Unión Postal Universal Indicia at the top. And it's in French, but also in Spanish at the bottom. Here's one of those unusual letters. unusual postal cards where Jamaica issued postal cards at a at the special rate then permitted in the time period after the conference of Bern 76. The value was indicated with red hand stamps, but they were sold with the red hand stamp. And so this is just another one of those interesting varieties. But if you notice in the upper left-hand corner, it says in manuscript, inadmissible, Antigua not composed in postal union. So it was also sent to a non-member, and it was presumably sent back to the sender, but it is possible that it could have been delivered in Antigua, except that there's no Antigua receiving mark. Here's one of the world's first, this is the world's first reply paid postal card. And it was interestingly sent to Austria. Austria, Hungary, the German states were all part of a postal union. And so everybody spoke German in the postal system. And on arrival in Austria, the recipient and the post office had not heard anything about reply paid postal cards. They read the instructions on the bottom of the card on how to return it. So the sender added the postage and posted it. What's interesting is this use was illegal because Austria, shortly after these cards started arriving in Austria, issued a prohibition on the use of reply paid postal cards in Austria. So the postal union among all these German-speaking states did not apply to reply mail. And it would not be until the Universal Postal Union established the special convention on reply paid postal cards that Austria and Germany would agree to accept each other's reply paid postal cards, but they would not do so under the German Postal Union. Here's a Natal postal card sent to the USA before Natal was a member. And if you notice in kind of a red pencil, grease pencil, it shows a credit marking to the United Kingdom, but this is only part of the full credit because when you add up the credit plus the postage paid, Great Britain was giving Natal and other non-members a discount rate of 1 penny off of the normal credit required by the UPU. Destination Hong Kong from non-member Natal, a ship letter fee to Ceylon at 4 penny, a GPU letter fee from Ceylon to Hong Kong at 4 penny, and then the 1 penny Natal charge, all adding up to 9 pence. This is the only example of this kind of rate I've ever seen. Here's Japan to Germany, the Indian Far East rate of 5 cents or 25 centimes. The card was designed for Japanese calligraphy, but a German sent it and turned the card the European way to write the address. Non-compliance with rules on stickers, the UPU officially did not accept stickers, but for those countries using return address mail stickers, they were tolerated. Underpaid with the each of the next 2 subsequent days, a stamp was added so that it became a overpayment of 1 Kreutzer because at this time Austria didn't issue a 1 Kreutzer stamp. Pre-GPU from Netherlands to Milan, Italy with 20 centimes, 20-cent stamp to pay a 40 centime rate, ignoring the 2.5 cent on the postal card. Ottoman Empire was a pioneer in putting indicia on its postal cards so that people would know where it came from. Same thing for Portugal. But for Portugal, the indicium was to inform the general public what this postal card was valid for. So if you translate the Portuguese, it says for the countries of the General Postal Union. So people would know that this would be an overpayment for domestic. Canada issued a special card for use to the United Kingdom before it was a member of the GPU, and these cards would later be used to other countries as well. Finland had indicium in 3 different languages, so they had Swedish, Finnish, and Russian. This is part of the Italian-Australasian postal agreement. It was paid at the UPU rate and underpaid by 5 pence, so it was charged 10 pence. This is a Russian provisional being hand-stamped by a postmaster in contravention to the rules. There were 5 of these little villages throughout the Russian Empire where when the rate was lowered from 5 to 4 kopeck, the postmasters marked them, and in this case, the marking is huge. That's the 1875 marking, indicating that only 4 kopeck was paid. And I guess we're kind of running out of time if I'm going to make time for Q&A, but these are just some of the other items that I had thrown in at the end. So I guess that's it. If you want to have questions and answers, or if you want me to describe the remaining 3 cards, I can do that.
Thank you. Questions?
James, I was just complimenting you, but one of the things I was trying to understand is your reference to exemptions to India postal card of no more than 6 annas. And I haven't found any reference either Indian post office notices nor
You
literature.
misunderstood my statement.
I'm sorry?
You misunderstood my statement. My
Right.
comment on 6 annas was the letter rate, and half of the letter rate would be the 3 anna rate. And the India exemption was that India did not have to issue a postal card until 1st April 1879, but in fact they did not issue it until 1st of July 1879.
Right. But just to kind of edification of what you just said. So as I recall, and there's fairly good literature, I'm sure, James, you know, about the postal rates for outgoing mail from India to different countries besides England. And I can't recall 6 anna, at least that was not the rate in the time frame you're referring to for UK. Now it might, but for letter rate I'm referring. So I'm still confused about the relevance of 6 anna exemption. So I'm just confused. I'm pretty slow at learning.
If you borrow my book from the APRL, you can Xerox those 4 or 5 pages that discuss it.
Thank you.
Can you talk about the volume of these cards sent over time?
Just Great Britain issued almost 1 billion postal cards before the General Postal Union.
Mm, okay.
The United States also had huge numbers. So small countries obviously are not going to have big numbers, but trading powers all had really big numbers. And that would include Germany and Italy and Spain.
Have you seen any evidence or material related to how these cards were described, perhaps hanging on the walls in the post offices where they were made available? Is this something that was explained when you walked into the post office? Is there any ephemera related to these cards and their
Well,
usage?
in my book, I actually show an article from a major Philadelphia newspaper where not only did they provide a write-up on and an example of what a card looked like, but they also distributed cards to their subscribers, and they printed information about the cards on the message sides, and all that's in the book.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Any further questions? Thank you very much. Appreciate your taking part.
My pleasure.